Hello everyone, here's a surprise. Today we're going to talk about a new version of Jane Eyre. Well, it's not really new, but it's new to me! Years ago, back in 2015, I went on a mission to review every adaptation of Jane Eyre that I could find. Then, once I had run out of adaptations, I followed that project with a series of adaptation comparisons. This 1961 TV adaptation is one of the obscure ones I had to miss because it was not widely available, and for all I knew, it was lost. But it's up on Amazon now, and I'd like to say a special thank you to Courtney, the Christian Vintage Gal, for letting me know. The info on Amazon and IMDb will tell you that this version stars Sally Ann Howes and Fritz Weaver. When I saw that listing, I said to myself, Fritz Weaver? And my mom had the same reaction. Fritz Weaver? Now, there is nothing wrong with Fritz Weaver. He was a great character actor who made memorable appearances all over the place. He's just not someone I'd expect to see cast as Mr. Rochester. As it turns out, that cast information is misleading. When Rochester showed up about 5 minutes into this, we both said, "That's not Fritz Weaver." It took me a long time to recognize, however, that the actor was in fact Zachary Scott, and I should probably give up my old Hollywood fan card for this, but in my defense, I always expect Zachary Scott to look the same as he did in the 1940s in films like Mildred Pierce and The Mask of Demetrius. Fritz Weaver is in this Jane Eyre. It wasn't a complete lie, and he does get second billing, but that's because Zachary Scott receives a special guest star credit. That was so needlessly confusing. This short version of Charlotte Bronte's novel aired on CBS in 1961 as an episode of Family Classics. I don't know about the entire series, but this particular episode was hosted by none other than Joan Fontaine, who played Jane Eyre on film nearly 2 decades earlier. So that's a neat Easter egg. I've got to tell you, I had 2 separate reactions to this adaptation. I watched it the first time and came away feeling underwhelmed and not caring much for the lead performances. But then I watched it again the next day. I just was going through it to get my pictures, and my response was far more favorable. I got a lot more out of the performances, and I ended up enjoying it quite a bit. So then I had to rewrite my script. As an adaptation of the book, it does leave a lot to be desired. It has many of the ingredients that make up the story, but I don't think anyone can do the book justice in less than 2 hours, which is why the most faithful and most satisfying adaptations are the miniseries. The shorter the adaptation, the more simplified and truncated the story has to be. And unfortunately, what always gets cut in these abbreviated adaptations is Jane's childhood. The Gateshead and Lowood sections are completely skipped. We meet Jane as she arrives at Thornfield for her new position as governess, which puts the focus on the romance instead of on the individual protagonist. Her voiceover fills us in on the necessary details, but it doesn't tell us what kind of person she is or how she became that way, and that's important stuff. That makes up the first third of the book. There's also no horse scene to introduce Rochester, and I guess I put a lot of stock in the horse scene because, according to my brother, I mention it in every single one of those old reviews. He was one of the only people watching the Jane Eyre project when it was originally going on back in 2015, and as someone who knew absolutely nothing about Jane Eyre, one of his biggest takeaways was that there's a horse scene at some point, and it can make or break the adaptation. Anyway, there is no horse scene in this one. Jane just finds Rochester sitting by the fire when she goes downstairs to get a book one night. The first time around, I found this incredibly anticlimactic compared to what I was expecting and how they're supposed to meet. But the second time, I did laugh at the way he almost startles her to death. On first viewing, I wasn't impressed with Sally Ann Howes as Jane. She's too pretty and probably too old, but more than that, I found her wide-eyed wonder and breathlessness a bit much. She starts out this scared little thing, easily cowed and a trifle flibberty-gibbety, and I felt like this isn't right. Because one thing people find remarkable about her, and Rochester finds refreshing, is her composure and apparent lack of fear. To all outward appearances, Jane Eyre is unflappable, and I did not get that impression here. But the second time I watched it, I paid closer attention to her expressions and intonation, and she's much more responsive than I originally gave her credit for. The character's independent streak isn't as heavily emphasized as it is in the book and other adaptations, but she does have a backbone. She does speak up, she does stand up to Rochester, and to Blanche Ingram. There's a part where Blanche is being a snot about governesses, and Jane delivers such an unexpected zinger that Rochester almost chokes on his drink. Sally Ann Howes, who I admit I was not familiar with, was better known as a singer than an actress. She's most famous for playing the character Truly Scrumptious in the movie Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. She doesn't sing here, though. She doesn't go in the Virginia Bruce direction. As for Zachary Scott, I didn't like him the first time around either. He portrays the character accurately enough, and plays whatever emotion is called for, but I didn't like his line delivery. It was off-putting and distracting. He sounded almost robotic in a couple scenes, and I even wrote in my notes, is he gonna talk like this the whole time? But I guess I got used to the sound of his voice and his way of speaking because it didn't bother me anymore the second time. I still noticed that he had an unusual voice, but it actually made him more interesting. Another thing that changed was my perception of their relationship. On first viewing, I felt that Jane's falling in love with him was almost taken for granted, that the adaptation didn't do enough to sell me on their attraction, that they weren't given enough time together, that their interactions were unbalanced and lacked a crucial spark. I still think that camaraderie founded on mutual respect that's supposed to develop between them is underplayed, but the second time, I felt there was evidence of attraction and the dynamic shifting. I did sense the chemistry between the actors, and there was a feeling of kinship. There was a spark between them. More dialogue would have been even better. You know, I love Jane and Rochester's banter. But as it stands, I do feel like their relationship, and the characters themselves, are sufficiently developed. As for the other characters, for some funny reason, they squeezed Mrs. Fairfax, Grace Poole, and Blanche Ingram into scenes where they wouldn't normally appear. Both Mrs. Fairfax and Grace Poole show up in the hall after Jane puts out the fire in Rochester's room, so there goes some of the intimacy of that sequence. Because Grace Poole is so present, and there are conversations between her and Rochester, and her and Mrs. Fairfax that we're privy to, which are pretty revealing and chip away at the mystery, the only person in the dark, really, is Jane. It's as if the adaptation assumed that we already knew the twist, which is an interesting choice. Probably most people tuning in to Family Classics to watch Jane Eyre did know the twist. I dare say the likelihood back then that most people already were familiar with the story was much greater than if it was airing today. Fritz Weaver does show up, playing the heck out of Richard Mason, who is portrayed as a much slimier individual than usual. I still can't help wondering what his Rochester might have been like, and it might have been fine, and I admit that there was a moment the first time around when I thought, shucks, maybe that would have been better. But that was before Zachary Scott won me over. Both leads grew on me individually and as a unit. Once they become a couple, Jane and Rochester are kinda cute together, and I had zero trouble believing, either time, that they are into each other. And in the dramatic scenes where the acting really counts, the proposal, the post-wedding scene, the reunion scene, they both do a fine job. If you just give them a chance. The narrative does get somewhat wonky again in the latter section as the adaptation makes more extreme but predictable cuts. It skips over Jane wandering and almost dying and goes straight to her teaching in a little school where we briefly encounter St. John Rivers. He's portrayed as a significantly older, rotund man with so many exaggerated mannerisms that he feels like comic relief. He is nothing like St. John in the book or any other adaptation. His proposal is the only silly scene in the whole thing, which makes it feel out of place, and in contrast with Jane's crisis of indecision in the book, here she doesn't seriously consider it for a second. They actually devote more time to what's happening at Thornfield in Jane's absence, which is surprising given that the story is supposed to revolve around her, but several other adaptations have gone in this direction too, and I thought what this one managed to pull off here was fairly good, considering the technical limitations. And since they cut everything with Jane's family from the first half, it was easily dispensed with in the second half. I do feel strongly that not having it does alter the story considerably, since Jane Eyre is supposed to be about a young girl with a passionate, rebellious spirit who encounters hypocrisy and survives the horrors of a charitable institution, growing up into this young woman who has a hunger for love and kindness, but also values her moral convictions and her self-respect. And most important is the lesson she learns about forgiving those who have wronged her. And that's why it's important to have the whole thing with Gateshead and Mrs. Reed, and then going back to answer Mrs. Reed's summons and forgiving her, because that paves the way for Jane's forgiveness of Rochester, who, yes, does a horrible thing, but he always loved her and he never meant to do her any harm, whereas her own relative hated her guts and was willing to do anything to kill her and condemn her, short of actually murdering her herself. And yet Jane is able to forgive her in all sincerity. And if she's able to forgive her, of course she's going to be able to forgive Rochester. That's why Jane's childhood and all that other stuff is so important, and that's why these abbreviated adaptations inevitably fall short. They just don't have the runtime to accommodate all this material that makes the book rich, that gives it greater depth. It's not just a gothic romance about a governess falling in love with her boss and then finding out that he's already married. Don't get me started. Obviously, they felt they didn't have time for the Reeds or the Rivers or any of that stuff, so they skipped it, and I understand completely. I just think it's too bad. We do get back on track in the final segment, however, which culminates in a touching reunion that is quick but sweet. Both times I watched it, I thought they did a really good job with the final scene. The dialogue isn't exactly canon, but I was moved and the acting is solid. I might have been even more satisfied if he had been maimed as well as blinded, and if they had included the fact that he regains his eyesight later, but we've only got 55 minutes and we can't have everything. Initially, I would have said this adaptation was just okay, but having seen it a second time, I'm gonna say it's pretty good. It's actually better than most, if not all, of the abridged TV versions that are out there. It does have its curiosities. Rochester punches Mason in the church. I don't recall that happening in any other version. The scene with Rochester and Jane after she saves him from the fire has a weirdly abrupt ending. It works fine in context, but It's disappointing if you know what's supposed to happen. He asks her to stay a while, and she agrees, but we don't get the prolonged goodnight and him not letting go of her hand, which, hello, what kind of romance is this if you've removed the first overtly romantic interaction? And while they make a big deal out of him giving her a veil, there's no payoff where Bertha tears it up in the night, so I wonder if that was a scene that was cut last minute. I believe this production was filmed live, but pre-recorded, which is why it has a certain roughness to it. Zachary Scott almost flubs a few lines, which I appreciate because it feels a little more realistic. People trip over their words all the time in real life. And it was noticeable that Sally Ann Howes kept her bridal hairpiece on through the whole second half. I'm assuming for convenience, because while I don't know a whole lot about hairstyling and updos, I do know that it's much easier to add something than to take it away. I think this could have been really interesting as a more fleshed out adaptation. Give it 45 more minutes, increase the budget, polish it up a bit, let the actors go outside, since that's where half of Jane Eyre takes place. I'm not saying all of this would have made it a great adaptation, but I think it could have been a contender. As it stands, it's probably the best of the short, old TV productions. And I realize that's not saying a whole lot, since the other three I've seen were... Yikes. But in all sincerity, I think this is pretty good. Do I recommend it to someone who doesn't know anything about Jane Eyre, but is curious and wants to watch a movie instead of reading the book? No. A mini-series would be better, but if that's too much of a time investment, there are other feature-length films that are more complete representations of the story. But if you're a die-hard Jane Eyre fan and a completionist when it comes to adaptations, and I know many of you are, then yes, you should see it. It's not free on Prime, but it's not expensive, and the film quality is pretty good. It's a little fuzzy, but if this is all we have, I'm not going to complain. What Amazon is streaming is an unedited recording of the full broadcast, which includes ads for the show's sponsor, Breck Hair Products. Those are fun if you like vintage commercials, and keep an eye peeled. I believe one of the models is Tippi Hedren. I hope you enjoyed this review. It was so nice to talk about Jane Eyre again, and those of you who are still here, who were with me through the adaptation comparison series, I'm sure you were happy to see some Jane Eyre coverage on this channel again. It's been a long time. If you have seen this version, I'd love to hear your take on it. If you haven't seen it, but you decide to check it out, I hope you'll come back and let me know what you thought. And hey, if you didn't care for it the first time, maybe watch it again, because that can make a difference. Regardless, I look forward to hearing from you in the comments below, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.